The following podcast is sponsored by Basico. At Basico, we understand your needs and pain points. Our expertise in CFO services, legal, finance IT, and people and payroll helps drive your business forward by inspiring change and challenging norms. We believe in deep explorative discussions and critical angles, the same spirit that fuels the Only Constant podcast hosted by our own Lasse Rindom. Discover more about Basico's vision and services at basico.dk. And if you like what you hear in this episode, please don't hesitate to share it with a friend. And now Lasse, take it away.
You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Jason Stanley, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi Jason, welcome to The Only Constant. I'm really happy you're here with me today, and I've been looking forward for months for this episode with you, because I remember the first time we spoke, and also some of the posts you've been writing is like you seem to have this, channel into some kind of truth about AI and some deep thoughts, and you're probing the eternal wisdom of AI. No, I'm joking you. But so I'm setting the bar right now, okay, Jason? So that's the point, right? But I'm really, really happy you're here with me today. So welcome to The Only Constant.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm super happy. I really enjoyed listening to the episodes from the podcast. So this is going to be fun. Definitely.
And also insightful, I hope. So, Jason, my first question is basically, what are the real AI development frontiers, from a large scale operations viewpoint?
Yeah. And so maybe I'll just caveat this by saying that by large scale operations, what I interpret that to mean is large scale organizations, because you could interpret it in an alternative way where, for example, ChatGPT, which is for the most part consumer facing and has hundreds of millions of users run of a week, is very much a large scale operation, right? But I think what we're talking about here is like large scale enterprises or organizations trying to incorporate AI into them. The frontier here, absolutely, I think, is about things that, for the most part, the leading labs are not really working on, right? The stuff that we read about in the press about what the labs are pushing out, the new models that are coming out, is largely about model advances, right? And being, measuring those advances using public benchmarks and whatnot. That's really important, but this is a little bit in my mind like having labs focused on building engines that are extraordinarily responsive to whatever kind of injections you might give them. And that's great, but engines that are responsive don't create vehicles that are trustworthy and safe and enjoyable to ride in and so on. And they certainly don't create the kind of infrastructure you need to have many vehicles running around in a city in a safe and trustworthy way. So what we're thinking about in a large scale organization or enterprise setting is very much those other questions, like what do systems need to consist of in addition to beyond those models that make them trustworthy, reliable, auditable, in the right way, because different use cases inside an organization won't always require the same amount of each of those things. There's certain kinds of high risk, high volume activities that may be under regulation and so on that require auditability, trustworthiness. Organizations are not going to implement technologies there that they don't understand well or that they can't report on publicly well and so on. There are other use cases inside organizations, large organizations, kind of knowledge work style use cases where that's not the case. We don't have hard-worn, well-understood workflows that operate at extraordinarily high volume and where we have a very tight kind of governance system layered on top of them as a result of historically learning about how to do that well and how to control and steer it well. Think, for example, about the kind of quarterly work that your executive team might be doing to prepare for a strategy session. There's maybe high consequence, but the cadence with which it's done is low, and there's a lot more room made for creativity, different approaches, and it's also typically filtered through the executives or whomever, those leaders doing the work of actually synthesizing and deciding on strategy. And so it's an input into a process that's very human controlled. And so the degree to which an organization may allow for the kinds of things the ambiguous processes and ambiguous creations, generations, there may be much higher than it might be in the case of, say, an IT operations desk, where you may be processing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of tickets in the run of a week. And you need things to be nailed down tightly and want to understand what's happening and whether or not you're actually operationally improving things for the customer, for yourself, for your bottom line, and so on. So all that to say, to come back to, I think, in general, inside large organizations, what needs to be innovated on is all these pieces, the infrastructure, the components that get put together to create a system, because the system is what's used and what's deployed. The model is just an input into a system. It's a component in a system, just like an engine inside a vehicle is a component. No driver is running around with an engine. They're running around with a vehicle. And in addition, they're running around with a vehicle on infrastructure that's been designed in a way to allow for, efficiency, trustworthiness, safety, security, and so on. So those are all the pieces that need to be developed and designed. And I think that the innovation and scientific challenges are as big there as they are on the model side. There's dramatically more attention being put, both from a public relations perspective, but also from a science perspective, I think, on model development right now than there is on these other components. But I think that's starting to shift. The agent era forces a shift on us, because agents are not just models; they are systems that require, memory and context engineering and so on and so forth. So
don't you think it's like a little bit like, in Europe, of course, you're not in Europe, but we watch a lot of football here, soccer, or what, I don't know even what you call it in Canada where you're at, right? What do you call it, football or soccer? What side are you on?
In general, people refer to it as soccer. So we're a soccer family.
But for me,
there's a bit of a debate internally. Yeah,
but for me with AI, it's like everyone's focused on the Lionel Messi or the Cristiano Ronaldo, right? But no one's even looking at the support cast they have as well, right? So they always win the Ballon d'Or, or the big, best player in the world, right? So is that the same? It's as an analogy, is that what you're saying as well with these AI models? That everyone's just looking at the engine to some extent, but the whole support cast, the whole off the ball movement is not even considered.
Yeah, this whole big man theory of history, I guess, is I guess that's similar. Yeah, we like to cast simple narratives. It's easy for us to celebrate genius and greatness in the form of individuals, as opposed to, I don't know, like the team, and the team here being actually the players on the field. Beyond that, the players on the bench, but of course, like the team that makes Inter Miami or pick your team work is much bigger than that. I think David Beckham would like to take credit for the orchestration of many of the reason that Messi is there has a lot to do with the owners and the investors and the coaches, and and I tend to come from a perspective where understanding all of these things is crucial to understanding outcomes, as opposed to thinking that there's an actual individual. But there's a risk also there of slipping into a situation where you deny agency and
but there's definitely agency, right? But there's also these, some of these players are the best ones are those that just keep on doing the same things. They just make it tick on the midfield, right? You just move the ball around and move it quickly around. They advance a little bit all the time, but they don't do this. Now I'm going to skip past 3 players and score a goal. But in order to have that player, you need to also be able to supply him, right? And I think that's where my my analogy comes from, right? That there's something that has to supply these AI. Like you just said, it's just an engine. It's not the steerability. It's not the how comfortable is it to. It's not the car in itself, right? So. And I want to, you said you talked a lot about this whole, when you have creative or more creative room in like a strategy conference every third month, every quarter, every year, or something like that. Is AI actually, we're expecting it to be the reliability part, right? The thing that does mass operations, so we don't have to do that anymore. But is it actually better suited maybe for the creative brainstorm sessions? Is that what you were getting at a little bit, or is that what you mean?
No, I don't think it's necessarily more suited for that. I think it can perform equally well in a variety of use cases. So in the context of a strategy session, it can dramatically speed up and deepen the kind of research and the connecting of dots across a humongous pool of information and signals compared to what a typical human or team of humans can do in the same amount of time, right? I can run a deep research query and it can spend a couple of minutes and come back with something that a typical human, even an expert human, in many domains, not in all domains, might take weeks to produce. And I could run 100 of them, and I could run 100 of them in a day, and it would take a sea of people or a sea of time to create the same amount of value. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be orthogonal value that a human, and in particular a human expert, might come up with, but it's really not a question of replacement here. It's about augmentation, I think. Although a certain amount of that is absolutely going to mean replacing the work that, I don't know, like a junior analyst might do to prepare a leader for participating in a strategy session. Like, a lot of that work certainly can be done by a deep research style agent today, and then that person may or may not have additional work to do in that occupation, or the occupation may marry with some other family of tasks and become something different in the future. So I think there's a lot of value that created there, but there's also a tremendous amount of value that AI, sort of modern AI, can create in high volume, highly repetitive tasks where RPA just wasn't up to the task, right? RPA continues to be famously very brittle, and that meant that it was difficult to operate at scale in all but the most repetitive kind of situations, right? There's always going to be edge cases and evolving data distributions and things like that. And what you get from LLMs is the capacity to work across those changes without always fiddling with the RPA to change it, to manually craft it to the changes. Now, what needs to accompany the LLM in those kinds of contexts is all the trappings around it, which we just discussed, right? It's the steerability, it's nailing it to a workflow that's understood and auditable, ensuring that the way you're using LLMs is grounded in the right way, right? So if it's a high volume process that tends to involve some amount of risk, and some cases that are high risk, you're going to want there to be a significant amount of work done on how to govern LLMs. But the value that it can bring is undeniable, right? And it's just a different kind of value from what you might get for a strategy session.
So what you're saying is more like, flexible paste on the top of an RPA process or something like that? Is that what you're implying a little bit? Or because you still have to scaffold it and build all these systems around it, right? Like you did with RPA, but then, it just doesn't break as easily because it's more flexible.
Well, I mean, so I wouldn't shake a stick at that. Like, if it does what RPA dreamed of doing, but it does it in a much more sustainable, scalable way, that's already a massive value add for a lot of organizations. But I think it goes well beyond that. Like, you're now able to consider how, think about an IT operations desk or something like that. Like, you could take that workflow, introduce LLMs in a governable, understandable, auditable way, and scale your operations tremendously with that kind of technology. But where we're moving is, okay, so can the agent that's doing that actually start doing a new family of tasks that go beyond what an IT operations desk did in the past. Why not, right? If you're able to actually start orchestrating things, there's no reason why agent workflows or human workflows need to look like the workflows we've had in the past, right? Those are historical artifacts. I think we certainly don't want to get into a situation where we throw the baby out with the bathwater, where you think that, oh, LLMs are so great. Why don't we just get them to do all of these things and away with the workflows, because we're moving to a world where new kinds of workflows exist, and let the agents create those. Because that removes the controllability, steerability, understandability, auditability pieces that we absolutely need in large organizations and in many contexts in society for very good reasons. We're going to have to get to a situation where we today leverage the value of those understandable and auditable processes and be open to how those things evolve in a responsible way. Like in 20 years, almost certainly we'll be working with very different kinds of organizational structures and workflows, and we need to get from today the steerability and controllability that we have today with the current workflows to that tomorrow, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, because it sounds like you're a little bit conflicted around that, right? And the whole control versus the autonomous thing, right? So we have models that can do more and be more autonomous, maybe look differently, the workflows, but we still want to sort of know what they're doing. We still want to have the benefit of a workflow where, you have a trigger and you have an output and you can sort of measure, okay, it did it. We can measure the value, or, you get my point. So it sounds like you're a little bit conflicted there. Is that the big conflict we're seeing? Is that the big conflict, or what do you think?
Well, I guess I see it as similar to the conflict we have with humans, right? Like humans are not, we don't have an easy interpretability algorithm for people. Over time, we've learned to have a good expectation for how people behave. We have rules and laws around it that tend to condition people to act in specific ways. But we know that there's always a risk that people actually behave in different ways, right? We read about it in the paper all the time. And yet we accept the certain amount of ambiguity and risk of those things happening, because the value of all the creative energy and labor and everything of having people work on things and work collaboratively on things is necessary to create the value that organizations want to create over time. And so I see this as a similar kind of thing. Like what is the infrastructure around agents or LLM systems, LLM-powered systems, that needs to be created to allow us to feel comfortable with the role that we're giving them inside organizations. It's not something we haven't faced before. We faced it with people and other forms of non-deterministic technologies. I think now we face it at a scale we haven't faced in a very long time.
Yeah, and we haven't seen it with machines before either, right? Or things before. We sort of, spent, 5,000 years perfecting how we work in societies and how hierarchies work, responsibility work, laws and all that. And suddenly we are, at least 5,000 years since we started writing about it, right? So even more than that, probably. So, and suddenly we're giving it to a thing, right? And that just seems like there's so much accountability, responsibility, so many laws, so many, you say it's the same, but is it the same? It is not the same, but it's a different thing, isn't it? Or I don't know. I actually think that's a very, very difficult thing to actually grasp. I'm having trouble getting my head around it, but I see these, there's always an owner somewhere, a human owner somewhere, but now suddenly he's just having more complex systems he has to surveil or control, right?
Yeah. So just to come back to what you said, I wouldn't say it's exactly the same thing. I just think it's there's a rhyme at play here where I think there's a tendency in the field of AI, and maybe this is true of all major technology fields when they first start to arise, that a lot of people working in the field think what they're doing has never been done before, and there's really no lessons to be learned from anywhere. And I think this is nonsense and more a reflection of just the extraordinary naivete of a lot of people who work in the field. They can be very brilliant and could be good scientists at a very niche thing and not understand much about the history of science, the history of technology, just even contemporary adjacent technology fields and what's happening in them and what we can learn from them. So that's just a bit of a sidebar.
And people are very synchronous, right? I always say they're synchronous. They're looking at right now, right? And this here now. Okay, we can replace everything now. Okay, but what will come then of jobs in the future? No one has a clue. No one can even think that thought. It's like the future and the past doesn't exist, yet it's somehow sometimes also everything that exists, right? Anyway, yeah.
100%. Yeah, so to come back to the question, it's true. Like, it's not, it's certainly not the same thing. It's not the same thing in a couple of really critical ways today, anyway. And one of them is accountability, right? And machines are not accountable for what they do. And the second, I think, really important way, and I know that there are many of these, but the second that comes to my mind initially is the hijackability. So we have a poor understanding today of how to prevent our systems from being hijacked by adversarial parties. Internal and external. I think we're seeing the discoveries of current vulnerabilities using fairly, not very surprising or innovative attacks. We're constantly seeing new discoveries, and then we're seeing the science or the experimentation on the attack side gallop at least at the same pace, if not faster, than any kind of pace on the defense side. And yet we're starting to deploy these systems because the economic value, and in some cases the social value or personal value, seems to be there. And so we're deploying without having solved, and potentially without having solved that security problem, and probably as a result, the sort of the security debt, if you will, or the vulnerability debt is growing. And so I don't think that's, obviously, employing more and more people in an organization, you're incurring some amount of that debt as well, because people are also, there's also the possibility that people do bad things. But I think that the hijackability from afar, and the notion of canaries or poison being planted and suddenly having an effect a long time after the thing was planted, all of these things are create new kinds of vulnerabilities that don't exist in the human context. So there are absolutely some new things that we have to deal with there.
The flexible pace, the unstructured, the way they can work with ambiguity and all that, that actually also mean the way that they resemble humans but are still machines, basically just also means that the surface for attacks is just so much bigger, because the things they can do more flexible is also something that can be attacked on the same, if you say, a typical RPA flow would understand 1 cubic centimeter, then an RPA bot, an GenAI bot would understand, 1 cubic meter or more than that. It was much more than that, right? That also means that the attack volume or surface, I'm using volume and surface the wrong way, but you get my point. So if you say surface instead of cubic meters, but saying square meters, right? Then the attack surface is just so much bigger as well. Is that what you're saying?
So the attack surface is exploding in size. Is it? It's partly related to the fact that our generative AI tools now are able to understand and ingest things that previous RPA systems had a great amount of difficulty understanding and ingesting. It's also partly related to the fact that our technologies around both context size for inputs, but also context engineering, memory management, all these things are galloping forward. And so it allows for the integration of a lot more material.
You can now make the system agree with being hacked, basically, as well, right? To some extent.
Right. And so that's a novel thing as well. I don't understand the history of RPA all that well, but I'm going to guess that in general,
but I mean
there's very little intelligence.
Also just standard IT, right? Just standard IT on structured databases, binary. They're a little bit less. They're not as binary as we're used to binary, right? You can argue with them and say, "Oh, please give me this," and then if you will jailbreak it, great. It will give it to you, right? And
sure,
that's a weird thing. Arguing.
Absolutely. In that sense, they're closer to human operators than they are to RPA systems, because social engineering has existed for a long time, and both in the past and today, in new and interesting ways. Social engineering, in other words, like attacks that leverage vulnerabilities of humans, susceptibility of humans to falling prey to certain kinds of tricks, is similar. And yet with humans, we tend to have a better understanding of how to prevent those kinds of attacks. They don't always work, but we have strategies and we can limit the amount of attacks. With LLM powered systems, we're only at the beginning of really understanding what's going on, and largely this comes down to this issue of us not really understanding how the models work, how they generate what it is they're generating. We don't have a full understanding of why they're doing what they're doing, and as a result, this kind of jagged surface area in terms of they succeed on average extraordinarily well across a wide range of tasks, but they fail cataclysmically in areas that we just don't expect them to fail. We don't understand why they fail in those ways. And so I think with humans, that's much less the case, right? We tend to have a much better mental model of where the strengths and gaps are, and we've built this social and organizational and in some cases technological infrastructure to accommodate and account for those kinds of gaps. So we don't have that today for LLMs.
No, and I wanted to ask you both, what are we then doing to sort of counter that? Or you're on the bleeding edge of this also in your work, right? So I want to get your opinion on how we're actually attacking this problem. I think that's really interesting. And obviously right now you don't have all the answers. But before that, I'd love to ask you, did you like GPT-5 when it came out, the way they took away? Now suddenly the model is choosing for itself how it will think, be reasoning or not reason, all that,
Yeah.
Are you a fan of that?
So, I followed all that very closely. So I think, there's a lot of confusion around this debate because GPT-5 itself is a multiplicity of things, right? GPT-5 is a family of models, right? It's not just a single model, it's a family of models. And it was the introduction of a new UX paradigm in ChatGPT that did away with the user's ability to select models and all that. And they thought they had good product reasoning for why they would do all those things. And it ended up having not working for everybody. But so the introduction of GPT-5 is not just the release of a new model. It's all these things together, right? It's the disappearance of the model picker. It's the notion that you can have a gateway router that decides for
what
you.
I'm looking at, obviously, Jason, is that also takes away some steerability for you, right?
Sure.
Because they sort of took it over, and I know they reverted
100%.
a lot, right? But so that's why I'm putting the words in your mouth. Do you like that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I absolutely didn't like the loss of steerability because I was one of those users who, proactively decided what kind of model I was going to use depending on the task that I was going to use. I think the massive ocean of people who are using ChatGPT were not doing that, right? And so their product reasoning was that we need to introduce changes to improve the experience for all these people that are not doing those things. So we can have a debate about whether or not that was the right product strategy to pursue, but certainly for my use case, and maybe for you and for other people who use this a lot and who spend a lot of time investing in using the tool, the disparate sort of models to their strengths and avoiding them for their weaknesses, it was an absolute not a good thing. But very quickly they reverted and made selection possible. And so today when I'm using it, I'm basically always using 5 thinking as opposed to allowing the router to decide for me. And I don't think I'm ever using the immediate fast option. Because for me, the use cases that I have, I'm comfortable waiting 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes to get a high quality answer.
I often end up in the opposite one. Actually, I like the fast ones. I've gotten very used to the 4.0 and the way they get, because I know how that works. I know how they will typically respond. I like that. As you said before, we don't know how they work, but so when I got a hint of how it is actually working, I think sometimes when I ask the thinking models, they it seems to be slightly ADHD like sometimes. So they go on detours. I'm like, why did you do that? I asked you for a short answer. Now suddenly you're giving me a book, and because you forgot about that, you sort of thought something else, and you polluted my prompt, right? And that annoys me. That annoys me so much. It really does.
I don't have that experience, and maybe it's just really the kind of use case that I have. But I will say there's one interesting thing about the changes that it kind of makes me laugh a little bit. But when I go back to an old chat, which sometimes I do, right? I go back to chats in the past because I'm like, oh, well, I've had a discussion about X topic before. Rather than start a new thread, I'm going to go back and ask it in that same thread. Partly because I don't have a good mental model of how ChatGPT manages its memory across threads.
No.
Okay, so that's an interesting sidebar problem, right?
Yeah.
Like from a user experience perspective, I don't understand how the memory works. And I know now it's cross-pollination across different threads is getting better, but like, I don't know. So I go back to these old threads and I'll ask any question and I'll get a response really quickly, and it will destabilize me a little bit, because I'm like, well, hold on a second. You didn't spend time reasoning about my problem. I suddenly am skeptical about the answer that you gave me, and then I look up at the top of the page, and it says 4.0, and it's because initially back then 5 didn't exist, right? It didn't exist for us as users, and so it was using 4.0, which was the good, with the model that the default model at the time. And so now I'm looking at that and I'm thinking 4.0, oh God, that's the previous generation of models. It didn't take time to think. I don't trust the answer. And it's really not about the quality of the answer. It's about me making assumptions about how the model operates, right? So this is it's an interesting kind of like
for me, I'm always, if it answers too fast, I like the Copilot answers. I'm like, no. You're or the AI overview on Google. I'm like, I trust nothing here. I trust absolutely nothing. So because it's so fast, so like immediately fast, right? Whereas when to start reasoning too much, I'm also like, stop reasoning now, because I know you're adding things to my task. And so, and for instance, I the old 4.0 was, and this is from, I always get my appetizers, what I put on the episodes. That's something that's just AI generated, because it's just the transcript, and I can set around what did we talk about. But I'll just ask it, okay, and then it gives me.
Sure.
4.0 always gave me the same structure, the same format, because I had taught it that, and it was always the same. GPT-5, it mixes it up every time, and that just
have you tried in your prompts to introduce the steerability again? Like, do you find that GPT-5 doesn't respond to your attempts to steer, or is it just that suddenly in the shift to 5, it has quote unquote forgotten
but
some of the
01 and 03
steering
before, the old ones did the same, right? They did the same. They just went off and did something different with because they thought this might be a better appetizer. No, I want it in the same format, right? But that's also besides the point. I just think it's interesting, this whole thing. I think the steerability is something I actually, in my daily work with AI, miss. And I don't know, and I understand you don't, and I also have friends who don't, but also have friends who also miss it. So it's like it's very double, right? It's a thing we started working with and getting used to in a different way, and then it changes and it changes and it changes, and I just think that's interesting as well, right? But is this so? But so GPT-5, from a steerability perspective, took something away. Perhaps we could say the way they thought about it.
The UX changes did.
The UX changes did, yeah. So is that what they try to do? Is that an answer or a problem to what I wanted to ask you about with the solutions to the control versus autonomy problem, or do we need to think more intricately about it? Or what could be answers to that problem that we spoke about before?
Well, yeah. So this is a really interesting topic. So that UX change didn't remove autonomy from the table. What it did was OpenAI took the autonomy, made the decision for users. And so the autonomy just shifted. It's not that the model itself or something like that suddenly removed autonomy from the table. It's that the organization of OpenAI decided, for product strategy reasons, that they wanted to make a decision about implementing a router to improve the experience of most users who were not actively deciding between models, apparently, anyway. And as a result, removed the autonomy for users, and that had the impact of making power users who were active selectors feel like they had been lost their autonomy. But it's not that the model suddenly took the autonomy away. So I think the analogy here of like what does it mean for organizations who are interested in steerability? In many cases, I think the organizations don't make decisions, right? It's like teams and individuals within organizations. But if we can just say like entities in the organization, other than the user, are going to in general be the ones who are going to make a lot of decisions about the steering decisions, right? They're going to say that in this use case, it's better for us to offer users the ability to select between this, that, and the other thing. And in this other cases, we always wanted to, for example, I'll just give you an example, like in a high-risk use case, right? If you're going to be doing something in an HR context, maybe the organization is going to set the architecture up in a way, and should set the architecture up in a way such that the compute budget is significantly larger for every incoming query than is the case if it's more of a humdrum, IT ticket case where the consequences of most of those tickets are not going to be as high as if you get things wrong on an HR case. And so they may decide that the latency, where they're comfortable with higher latency, they're comfortable with higher compute needs. They're comfortable using a reasoning model that's going to do, parallel consideration of hypotheses or whatever, these kinds of architectural innovations for HR cases and not for, say, IT cases or something like that. And that the organization, based on some kind of risk analysis, is and a bunch of experiments about what the reliability and robustness and so on looks like if you make this architectural change versus that one, is comfortable taking the steering decision in their hands and not allowing users to be the ones who always, decide, do I want more reasoning? Do I want less reasoning? I think that's appropriate. I think any given user isn't today in a non-AI workflows, isn't left, with the power to decide how the process should unfold. Many things are decided at the organizational level because, for standardization, governance, auditability, and so on, accountability, and so on and so forth. Many things are tamped down. So architectural changes and steerability may very well mean that some entity other than the user is doing a lot of the steering in general. And that
so what you're saying is essentially that don't look to the models for this. Look to your whole scaffold, the whole setup, the architecture around it instead.
Yeah, and I'd say that's true. That's been true.
That's classic IT.
That's yes, but even in the sort of like GenAI era, it's not new in the agent realm or anything like that. Models are different from prompts that sit on top of models, and prompts can be divided between, say, the prompts that a user may input and the system prompts that are designed by some admin or whatever. So steerability or alignment or whatever is, in general, the product of all of these things. There's a certain amount of alignment that does come from how a model is trained and fine-tuned and so on. But in general, from the user's experience perspective, what we experience as alignment or quality is the product of all these components working together, not just the engine on its own.
No, there's a lot of layers on top of the engine, and then there's all the things around the whole AI setup as well. So there's like tons of things going on here, right? When you do it the right way, and I think that's actually, and I almost know the answer to this as well, right? But I've seen so many of these conferences where you can go to where build an AI agent in 10 minutes. I'm always like, now Jason Stanley just told me that you need to set the architecture up, then you need to test this architecture versus this architecture versus this architecture, and see which one works the best, which one will which one can you steer and control, and suddenly we're out in, into what I also say that unlimited capabilities means unlimited testing, right? So it's just not, it doesn't sound like 10 minutes, Jason.
Well, I mean, look, a lot depends on what's at stake. There are lots of use cases where people are fully comfortable not doing all of that, and where those trappings and that testing and experimentation is not going to be required. If I'm
in an enterprise
developing,
setting? Really?
Well, okay, so I didn't say that. I'm just saying in the world, there are plenty of situations where you might design an agent in 10 minutes and it could actually be really useful, and you can be comfortable, quote unquote, shipping to production. Maybe it's just an agent to help you do something in your life better, right? Okay, so now if we shift to an enterprise setting and we're talking about deploying at scale, and either through volume or just the gravity of individual cases, risk accumulates, then for sure you can't be doing things where you're just shipping in 10 minutes. You're going to, unless you have a very substantial amount of work that's already been done to de-risk what's possible to build at 10 minutes. So you imagine a situation where you have a sandbox that teams inside an enterprise can use to build agents. And you've engineered that sandbox in such a way that the components and what's possible to build by combining those components and the infrastructure that any 10-minute shipped thing gets layered atop of provides you with a sufficient amount of auditability, steerability, and so on. Then maybe there will be lots of cases where you are comfortable carving out domains inside an enterprise to allow teams to be innovative.
You build a highway, it's easier to drive a lot of cars on it if you have a highway, right, than if you're driving off-road all the time.
100%, yeah.
So you're saying that, and now I'm almost putting words in your mouth here. I don't want to do that, but then go back to the displacement thing. So if you say in 10 minutes, no, it has not for enterprises. Does that mean that the whole displacement fear is also maybe a little bit exaggerated? If how long but the rule changes when we started to industrialize farming as well, right? 50, 60, depending on where you were in the world. But in Europe, we basically got tractors after the Second World War. Broadly, right? And then suddenly we move from having 50% of the people employed in farming to having, today, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4% or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't happen overnight either, right? It happened over a period of time. And people are so afraid right now of being displaced tomorrow, right? If everyone builds an AI agent that goes to production in 10 minutes, I get that. But is that really the case? Because I've spoken also to, Søren from Microsoft Business Central, working 2 years on the payables agents. I've spoken to SAP, working for years on building their agents as well, right? This is not something that you just do tomorrow. It's something that takes some time because you have to test all these architecture choices as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I have a couple of different answers to this. The first is displacement's not going to happen. Now, maybe I'll start with this. People in the AI field frequently contrast displacement with augmentation. And I think this is often a very silly debate because augmentation leads to a significant amount of displacement, right? Why? In many cases, not in all cases. So if you think of agriculture, right, we used to have a significant portion of the labor market working in agriculture, and now a very small amount. You could say that, well, this is large-scale labor displacement, but another way of thinking about it is just that, well, you have people operating machines doing the same kind of work, at dramatically larger scale. And so all that happened was you built technologies that augmented those people. And so, but I mean, it's silly. Like, of course, labor displacement happened. Like, a lot of people used to work in agriculture, and today very few people work in agriculture. It's nonsense to not think of this as displacement in some sense. So I think that moving away from that, there's the technology is getting good enough, but is not yet good enough for it to do many things that humans do well today, right? So there's that. How fast is the technology actually going to get better? I think we're seeing the slope of improvement. There's a lot of questions around whether the slope is increasing or decreasing or continuing apace. I don't want to get into all of those debates today, but certainly, even if we were to stop technological development today, I think there's from the product development and organizational development side of things, just leveraging what's already been developed, there's a huge amount of value to be created that we haven't yet discovered. So there's the technology is absolutely there to create a significant amount of displacement.
Again, but you don't want to answer if it's plateauing or if it's still exponential. You don't want to answer that.
We can get into that. I want to take this displacement question first because it's like it kind of marries a few things in my life. Like I used to work on labor market policy, and I'm a sociologist, and I've studied questions of labor market institutions and technology and politics and all these things. And now I'm working on a technology.
I actually didn't know that was your specialty. I knew you'd done sociology and all that, and so I'm like, perfect. That's definitely unfold this, Jason. Love it.
I'm not sure I have a specialty, Lasse, but I did do some of these things in the past. I'm not sure that we can get to the point of calling that my specialty, but like a man of many specialties. I absolutely. It's like the jack of all trades, the master of none, or something like that, right?
No, but I don't think that's the point. I don't think that's the point. I think you're a little bit deeper, maybe, than most people are in most of the things you've been doing in your life. That's just my hunch. Anyway.
Okay, so to come back to this, so the technology is absolutely, I think, there. The product development and like the infrastructure development around it still needs to be developed. But we're absolutely at a case where this isn't like quantum, where we're not sure whether we have something. We definitely have something, and that's something. There's a tremendous amount of potential for it to do things that today people do. And so displacing tasks, displacing whole families of tasks that today we call occupations or jobs, absolutely in the cards. And we're starting to see, although the evidence is a bit mixed, but we're starting to see impacts on junior level workers in industries that are most exposed to AI. But there's a lot of conflicting signals and confounding signals and so on. So Then you have the organizational side of things, like what needs to happen, even if the technology is ready, what needs to happen for organizations to use it well. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done there. Like there's the organizations, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, are just not yet adopting technologies that can do a lot for them in a way that allows the technology to help them do those things. Okay, so there's those pieces. And then I think there's a lot of interesting second and third order questions here that I think will quickly come into play. Imagine a situation where youth unemployment rises at a significant level. And you take that and you interact it with what we see happening in the world today, the rise of certain forms of liberalism, the rise of the right, populism. And you ask yourself, like, what happens when you have pockets of the population that are experiencing, their perceived suffering or marginalization in a context where political movements, so like populist political movements are on the rise? How does all that, combine together to create policy regulation, potentially
the richest
conflict?
1% gets richer and richer and richer as well, right? Yeah, there's some things there, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, until they potentially don't, right? We've seen situations in history where like there's a sort of like a dramatic blowback in the form of collective violence, conflict, and so on. And so not sort of like taking that into account as an endogenous part of the model that we're in and just considering it as like that happened in the past, but it's not going to happen, I think is infantile and a bit stupid. And so we're moving into a situation where displacement could create, political, economic, social currents that cause a significant blowback, and totally unclear what kind of impact that would have on the trajectory of the rollout and adoption of these technologies, and then as a result, whether there are big speed bumps that arise in the sort of displacement equation.
Yeah, but I think a lot of this would be my problem is with the whole doomers and boomers is that they're both saying this is fast and easy, right? And I think what you just said is also that this will take more time, also because organizations need to adopt to it. So now I think also that will take some of the blow also of having these mass labor changes, because if it doesn't move that fast, we won't see that many people being unemployed. And I also saw some of the signals on this that seniors are more sought after now than previously. So while juniors are not, seniors are, and that at some point will have to meet. You can't get seniors without juniors. There's something here that just, I don't know. To me, it seems to be disconnected, right? So for me, the speed here is really essential. If this happens tomorrow, then we're in big trouble, right? But if it happens over time, if it actually takes time to build and test the architectures, and actually just to get companies, I've seen a lot of companies doing a lot of AI, right? Tons of, I talk to them, and we do also AI for a lot of companies, but very few are actually have been putting this already into something that's actually touching on core operations or core production. It's always these writing some marketing copy, some of the non-dangerous stuff, right? And that's, so until we get to that point, I don't think we're necessarily in a danger zone.
So again, like there's a lot of signals coming from a lot of places, and so it's difficult to know exactly what's happening. But I've seen evidence that suggests the opposite, that and I think it's the McKinsey study from earlier 2025, which was reporting on data from up to the end of 2024, or maybe the very beginning of 2025, which feels a bit archaic at this point, but whatever. We don't have a lot of these studies around, and it showed that, if I'm not mistaken, either it's that study or maybe one that came up from Deloitte. But anyway, they looked at across sectors, across countries, large organizations, how many functions were implementing. So how many of the core functions in the business were implementing AI, and how many use cases were they taking up? And so they created this matrix where they demonstrated that it was certainly not just marketing and sales, although that was one of the core functions that was adopting it. You saw it in IT, HR, all the major kind of operational centers inside large organizations. All of them were covered, and all of them were increasing the number of use cases that were being taken up. And so if I read that to mean that in general, there's increasing penetration of the technology across these things, which doesn't mean that we're anywhere close to it being everywhere. Like I think we're still in the very beginning, early innings.
But I get that, right? And then I see, as I said before, and as Søren also spoke about in the podcast, that if I would just Business Central build this payables agent, took them a couple of years to build, right? And then I'm like, okay, so what are people talking about? And they're talking about, we got Copilot in this department, or we built a Copilot studio or something that talks with our SharePoint folder here, right? And I live in Denmark, right, where we are notoriously the most digitalized nation in the world, have been for I don't know, a decade or something like that. So I think if this was I'd be seeing it. We're not afraid of sharing data. We adopt digital technologies like no one else in the whole world, and yet it's not like these agents are floating around, right? It's not like everyone's just having agents doing things. They don't. They really don't.
Mm-hmm.
They have. Yeah. Most of them have, obviously the open chatbot, the LLM. Then they have maybe a tailored chatbot as well to speak to some data. And then some people build some automations. But almost no one I've spoken to has a real agent that has wiggle room and can do things and make decisions on its own. And so that makes me question all of these reports. Like, I'm like, what are they even talking about? And what are they calling an agent? And that's, then we're back to semantics and definitions. And I get so annoyed at that, right? Because it's just people like FOMOing like crazy, right?
Yeah. So the report that I just mentioned didn't talk about all of this as agents. They were talking about it as AI. And so a use case like using an LLM for generation of text or synthesis of text would still count. And I think there's a good reason to use that as a unit of analysis. There are, as you say, very few agents that are actually deployed. And also you can get a lot of value out of those classic systems, right? If you take a workflow and you were to take so-called non-agentic generative AI and insert it at key junctures in a workflow, we already see cases where that can lead to a dramatic increase in speed or a reduction in an increase in deflection and whatever, right? That can have real consequences for organizations. Maybe not.
But to do that, you also have to have, you need to have a setup where you can actually do workflows at scale, right? And that's even still the largest enterprise who can do that. And then they add AI to that. I spoke to someone who said that they were trying to build, that one of the problems for most enterprises was there were no people to take over and actually govern these things, build these, implement these things, and control them. There's no people, no skills there. There's no people to do that.
Yeah. So 100%, that's, I think, a challenge for organizations. This comes back to the organizational side of the adoption or displacement equation, that organizations are not, in many cases, ready to, A, take a system and make it valuable in their context, and B, even if they can do that, have the governance systems and auditability and so on necessary to do it in a responsible way. Responsible here meaning not just ethical, but also just like, appropriate behavior given regulation or what investors are expecting and so on. So I think that's but I think that's overcomable because we're rapidly learning best practices around these things. And also I think that the part of the product development side of the whole innovation drive is around discovering where there are sort of like repeatable processes, best practice and such that can be encoded in a product offering, and that product offering can deliver enough value to be valuable for lots of organizations, large and small organizations in a given vertical. So we're already seeing the rise of some of these kinds of product offerings in the context of like customer service agents and so on. So that, I think, what's tremendous about generative AI is that organizations that are small and that don't have a large pool of data to build their own models can take advantage of these tools, because they're general purpose language models that have learned on the whole of the internet or whatever, for good or bad. They've learned on the whole of internet and been sort of fine-tuned in such a way that they're actually useful for managing customer service tickets. And they don't need to know all the specifics about a small organization in order to be really valuable as an agent that can manage customer service interactions or something like that, right? And now the large organization might take the same thing and make it particularly good given all of the sea of enterprise-specific data that it has for their use cases. And so there's a bit more value that can be eked out. But even an off-the-shelf customer service agent trained on large bodies of external data and fine-tuned in a way that generally makes it a valuable customer service chat experience, can be valuable to all the organizations that don't have that internal data to build their own things. And I think that's a novelty of the GenAI era. In the past, with in large, for many of the classic machine learning use cases, if you didn't have your own data internally, frequently it was difficult for you to get access to a machine learning solution to a problem that you had internally.
Maybe what I'm actually also starting to think about a lot is maybe that this is not even a machine learning trajectory. The classical AI trajectory. This not GenAI is not on that. That to some extent, and one of my friends said that he doesn't even think that AI products, GenAI products, will be the big thing from GenAI. He was more like the way we can now build deterministic classic IT with these models, right? Because they can generate code. Is such a game changer. He's like, that is the biggest change to come from these things. So are we? Do you agree with that? I'm like, this is amazing. Vibe coding, whatever. Don't put it in production immediately, but it is a productivity increase like nothing we've ever seen before, and that can then subsequently increase more production. Because
I recognize that that's possible. I don't think that comes close to the value we derive from developing systems that leverage, and I'll use the neuro-symbolic term here, which we can dive into if you want, but that leverage neuro-symbolic architectures to allow for scalable work to be done on in situations where the workflow and the data and everything is not 100% repeatable and knowable in advance, where you need a certain amount of autonomy for the model and agent to be able to move around and interpret information, signal, text, images, whatever, synthesize, provide value to, could be to other agents, it could be to humans, in a workflow to allow much more to be accomplished than what's the case in the past.
There's some things here. I just saw it. Now I can see your face as well. I saw there was something here. You're like, you really want to explain this neuro-symbolic because that's what you think is interesting here. So that is definitely what you think is interesting here. And I think it's the first time, maybe I'm wrong, but that's the first time anyone has mentioned neuro-symbolic on the podcast. So that's why, Jason, please unpack that a little bit. Explain it a little bit before you explore with it.
Sure. So, there's, without going into too much detail, there has been and continues to be a very large debate, although the intensity of the debate is maybe shifting because of where we are in technology, but between these two camps, the connectivist and basically the approach that saw LLMs as, and the scaling laws of LLMs as being the future of intelligence, and that, getting us to AGI and so on, and the alternative approach saying that, without a kind of symbolic approach to artificial intelligence, without the kinds of world models and knowledge graph approaches to
more defined
intelligence creation, defined but also understandable and auditable and so on and so forth. And easy for a human to understand and check. Without that, we were never going to be able to get to AGI and be able to do it in a way where humans and organizations were comfortable deploying it, because they would never be able to understand it and control it and so on and so forth. And so there was long this kind of debate, and I think that over time the field, the model architectures and certainly the system architectures have evolved really rapidly towards this hybrid neuro-symbolic structure where you're leveraging the generative and I think generalizable capabilities of LLMs, which are undeniable, but at the same time rooting them in symbolic structures that can take the form of the tools that it has available to it, like whether some of those tools are symbolic tools itself, whether it is drawing on something like a knowledge graph. All of these things are being experimented with today and relate back to many of the things we discussed earlier in the episode around the infrastructure and trappings that you need to build around an LLM to make it steerable, controllable, understandable, auditable. Often involve incorporating symbolic components. It's at times, and maybe we could loosely consider a workflow to be a symbolic structure. it's human generated, it's understandable, it's auditable. It's not the same thing exactly as like an AI architecture that's symbolic, but I think loosely we can consider these things together. That today are the AI systems that we're deploying, and I would include the most advanced state-of-the-art systems that we're interacting with today, like ChatGPT, leverage this hybrid approach, right? That ChatGPT is calling tools that in some cases do have those kinds of symbolic rootings, and so that's I think where we need to go. I think there are open questions, and this is not my field of research and science, but like there are open questions around whether the model architecture itself, right, the internals of the model need to in some way gravitate towards being symbolic or some kind of hybrid versus the overall system, right? Taking an LLM, which in general we don't consider to be a symbolic approach, and rooting it in these components and tools and infrastructure that themselves are more symbolic, whether that.
But that's actually been one of
my.
I think that's been one of my first questions on the podcast. Actually, one of the first episodes. I can't remember which one, but I actually asked the question that we've spent so much time building symbolic AI previously. That was the approach mostly. These what do you call deep learning neural net AIs were sort of laughed at for many decades, right? And then but then suddenly now they worked because we got scale, we got more compute. Bam, we got more data, and then they could sort of generate. But now when we have those auto-generated AI, like an LLM, you don't know how it trained. No human wrote the weights. They were just generated on its own. Then suddenly we have to do all the symbolic stuff that to control them, right? So we're adding the same effort, but on the other side, or is it the same? I don't think you agree it's the same effort, but there's a weird, cosmic balance to this, that yin and yang. You get where I'm going with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't see it as a bad thing. I think had we never moved in the direction of LLMs, we wouldn't be where we are today. So like there's undeniable benefit that's come from.
But it's dialectics, right? It's not just, this road, it's actually a dialectic.
Yeah. And probably there's more than two. So it's not just a binary thing that the pendulum is swinging between. Probably there are many of these things. But certainly we need autonomy. We need autonomy to be governable and steerable. And how much of each of these things we need and what the balance is going to depend a bit on the use case, which is where we started our conversation. There are some use cases where you're going to be very comfortable granting a much wider room to maneuver to an autonomous agent to provide you with value because you consider that to be a really useful input.
Governance always depends on the use case, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and like the risk level at play, like what's at stake, is going to have a heavy role in helping you determine how much and what kind of governance and steerability you want versus situations where you're comfortable granting a significant amount of autonomy.
I wanted to also ask you about, does more data and bigger context mean better decisions? I think we already touched a little bit upon that. What I wanted to do with that question was actually ask you, a lot of people are saying when we just have bigger context for the models, we will have better AI. But, I used to say, but that just adds to ambiguity, and then they have to make decisions as well. But I think, I think you already answered this, right? But maybe you can just repeat, if you did, that more data does not mean better decisions, but symbolic in concert with these models means better decisions, right? That would be your position, right?
Okay, so I think these are a little bit orthogonal. So maybe more data can mean many things, right? It could be more data for training. It could be just exposing an agent to
what about
all of the internet
5
and so
trillion token context window? What if we say that?
Okay, so if we talk specifically about context windows, then I think what we've seen is that this aperture problem, right? So if you have access to too little information, it's very difficult to guess what's going on, to make to come up with good contributions. If you have too much data, you suffer from an opposite problem, which is that it's there's lots of distraction. It's much easier for you to make to come up with false relationships between variables, and for the value of the output to be diminished as a result. And so there's some in between there, and context engineering, I think, is that, and like this is how we manage the supply of and like the value of the context and evidence and whatnot that we're bringing to the agent's context window at any given time. So again, this comes back to context engineering is all about the trappings around the model. It's right how the delivery system for evidence and context. Are you doing it in a way that respects like, I don't know, the importance you attach to things like recency, expertise, authority, and so on and so forth, in such a way that you're delivering only the amount of context that needs to be there for the model to generate a high quality output. Now, it may be in certain contexts you need more context, and in other situations you need less context. I think it's going to depend a bit.
The conflict between focus and enough context, right? That's always the problem, right? Right.
But certainly I think it's the case that, so if we step away from context windows and just think about the basin of information that's available for the agent or system to select from for context, then having access to a lot is almost certainly better than having access to a small amount, right? If you think of like the value that we get from
but that was not the case for humans, right? It was, but it also wasn't. It is when it was like, we have an internet, we can share everything, we know everything, but then suddenly you have false data, and there's, I don't know. I'm a historian, right, by education. I always feel like every historian, every generation has tons of data. We have the same tons of data, but the narratives shift all the time still, right? The variables are still chosen different. And even sometimes when you have more data, it's easy to fall into rabbit holes or niches and get lost there. And whereas if you have little data, you don't do that.
Right. I think
you get my point.
The context, I understand. But almost certainly, if you didn't know what the small amount of information, I'm going to do a kind of like Rawlsian veil of ignorance to you here. If you didn't know if you didn't know what the small amount of information you would have access to is, would you prefer to have access to a small amount of information or a lot of information? Almost certainly, you'd choose the latter, and then you'd have new kinds of challenges. But I think we try to overcome those challenges by training people. Our version of context engineering for people is training you in critical thinking, research skills, and so on. And so we train you as a historian or as a, you name it, a biologist or sociologist. We train you to take advantage of the massive amount of data available to you to know what to go looking for and whether what you're finding is trustable and so on and so forth. That together with those skills, access to a much larger pool of information as potential context is much better than having access to a library with only 2 books, especially if you don't know what those 2 books are going to be. They could be anything, right? So
I can feel, I'm thinking about so many perspectives here, but I feel like if we go any further here, it gets very political. Because very liberal, conservatism, communism, authoritarian, we end up. I'm binging it here. Well, we end up in those problems, right? If I go further here, right? That's also the issue. And I think you delivered I like your answer, and it's very liberal, and I love it. So let's just keep it there. But Jason, I also want what actually for someone like you who is, and I remember you said that to me in one of our pep chats that you're on the bleeding edge of AI research at ServiceNow. So I'm asking, what bothers you the most in the current AI market? So what grinds your gears? When you're on LinkedIn or wherever, what would you like less of?
I think it's the massive gap between the way we talk about and even the way scientists work on evaluation in a context-unaware way, and the needs of what I call context-aware evaluation when we deploy. So what do I mean by all that? When new models are shipped, we're told they're better, they're safer, they're more secure, usually all of these things, and then we post benchmark results. So what's happening there is that a model is being evaluated, not a system usually, right? It's a model. And B, it's being evaluated against these pretty generic, non-contextualized benchmarks. In other words, like tasks that in general assess our ability to reason or our ability to do math, but don't assess our ability to reason on very specific kinds of problems that an agent might work on in when it's deployed. So you can think of this a little bit like, everyone's talking about the SAT scores of students graduating from an educational institution, and almost nobody is thinking about whether those students are well prepared to do any specific job. They're not going to go out and do SAT tests all their life, right? They're going to have to go and do something very specific. And so today in Society for Humans, right, we have specific, domain-specific exams sometimes, certifications, but we also have interview processes where organizations try to get a sense for whether you as a candidate are specifically well suited for what they need. And so there's a think of this as like a hierarchy or a spectrum or a supply chain of evaluations. In AI, what annoys me the most or what frustrates me the most is that we have so much attention being put on the sort of SAT side of the spectrum, and moreover that the who's doing the SAT? It's the model. It's not the system. And what gets deployed at the end of the day is a system that contains the model is embedded within a large array of architectural and infrastructural pieces, and it's being deployed in an organization with a very specific kind of data distribution. It's being asked to do tasks that are dramatically narrower, and in some cases quite different from whatever the general purpose evaluations we're doing. And this gap is huge. And this doesn't mean that the general purpose evaluations should go away. I think they still serve a purpose in the same way that we have tests for the quality of timber and are able to say that this timber meets, XYZ standard and so on before it gets put into a warehouse or a store or whatever. And then the people who are building structures, homes, say, go to those stores and can say, pick the timber that they want based on, whether or not it meets quality standards, and go out, build a structure, and then the kinds of tests that you would run to see whether the structure is solid are dramatically different from the ones that you will have run on the timber. And even answering a question like, does the timber work when it's in a home, is a very different kind of question from, does the timber work when the timber is just sitting in the lot and it's just a piece of timber, right? Why? Because you've drilled holes and nails and connected it to all these different things, and it's in, leaning in a certain direction, and so its load-bearing qualities have changed, independent of the fact that the house itself has its utility, its safety, security is measured in different ways from timbers, and so this big gap, I think, needs to be narrowed. It's being done a little bit in the shadows. Of course, organizations are running their own in-house evals and tests and so on before they're deploying, but in general, the science of those evals is poor. And there's far too much attention being put on these general purpose evaluations compared to these deployment-specific kinds of evaluations.
It's almost what you're giving me here is almost a platonic problem, right?
In the sense that
you have these synthetic idea, it's almost purely in the idea, how they test it, and then you deploy it, and the reality of the horse is different to the idea of the horse, right? It signifier thing. It seems like that duality in some form, right?
Yeah, I like to think of it more from a supply chain perspective. So models are real things. They're really shipped and they're really made available for open source download, and they're real inputs into a supply chain. And so it makes sense to evaluate them and to have a way of understanding whether they are high or low quality, high or low security. But we can't confuse those signals for whatever they're embedded in eventually as that thing being high quality, because it has a beating heart that was 5 steps prior judged to be high quality. Because when it's put in combination with other components, its nature itself changes, and B, what you care about when the thing is packaged is the attributes of the package usually, not the attributes of the beating heart that's inside the package. So I think what we need is this approach to supply chain intelligence, if you will.
It's more like teenagers, right? Like I raised a good kid and then he got some bad friends. Yeah,
I guess so. Except that this teenager's updatable and re-releasable and all of these things. And yet we can, we continue to just refer to the evaluations when they were still at home. Yeah. So maybe we're stretching the analogy a bit, but yes.
But it's also
things change.
But is it the same issue that because I have the issue with everyone's coming around saying now it's PhD level, and then you ask it a question and it fails, and I'm always like, a lot of people are making like majority, of people, ordinary people, laymen will be like laughing at that. They say PhD and look how stupid it is. Is it the same annoyance to some extent, or is it?
Well, so this comes back to this jagged frontier piece, right? So. The jagged frontier, I think, exists across use cases where AI can be amazing in general, right? Those general purpose evaluations will tell you it's like amazing in general. You deploy it from one use case to the next, it might be amazing, it might fail. But even within a use case, I think there are examples, in many cases, this confounds us. Like from one, it can do amazingly well, and 5 examples, and the next example, which seems to us as humans to be very similar to the other 5, it can fail for reasons that we don't understand. And so the jagged frontier is very real. It's hard. Look, the jagged frontier exists for humans as well. Like there are plenty of PhDs, including in the fields of computer science and IT and all of these things, who are amazingly brilliant at some of the things that they do, and then turn around, as we said earlier, and don't understand anything about the history of technology and make claims about the novelty of what they're doing and don't understand that that's actually laughable from a different
as well,
field.
right? You're a PhD as well, right? Aren't you? And we had trouble we had trouble just turning down the volume on the microphone before this recording, right?
Absolutely. I don't know what you're talking about, Lasse. We did not. No, 100%. So we have our own jagged frontiers. Usually the jagged frontiers are easier to predict for humans than they are for machines. And so that's the worrying piece. It's that the jagged frontiers are just hard/impossible for us to understand right now in a way that's
hard to get away, right? You can't teach. I could teach you how to turn down the volume, but maybe I can't teach this model to do that. And that might be actually that for me is the biggest worry, that maybe it will not learn like a junior legal will learn, but this will keep on being a dumb junior legal that will never learn, and you'll have to always review it. That's the fear, I think, for a lot of people also in this, right?
Or it won't behave. So what is learned? So what we observe is behavior. Right? This is true for humans as well. We observe that you behave in a certain way. I can't tell whether you think that was the best way of doing something, or whether you're doing something, that thing because you're scared of the consequences if you don't do it. Really, you think the better thing to do is A, but you're doing B because the consequences in your mind of not doing B are really high. And so from a model perspective, what we observe is behavior. Why that behavior manifests is a result of, again, coming back to this, it's the interaction of many of these components, right? Is it that the model itself wasn't trained and quote unquote didn't learn well when it was being trained in school? Or is it because it's being shipped information that is incorrect, right? So maybe the retrieval mechanism is not working well. Maybe it just has access to a sea of incorrect or erroneous or falsified information, and it has a hard time parsing what's true and what's not true. Is it because the memory has been poisoned? There's all multiple. Many of those things places, would not be quote unquote learning, right? It's
So Jason, I could go on talking to you about this. I think it's brilliant, and I think also the more that we talk, the more we're actually building on the previous things we've just talked about. And I think I actually feel this conversation very much alive. But I'm also very aware that our time, that I reserved a time slot with you, and it's running out. And maybe we should just reconvene at a later point as well for another episode, maybe in 100 episodes. Who knows? I'd love to do that. But Jason, I have one final question for you. Right. And I also think that people, if they want to know more, they can always connect with you and get to know more of what you're thinking. I have one final question, and I hope you're ready for that question. This is sort of the centerpiece, of the podcast.
Sure.
So, Jason, what is the only constant?
So this is a difficult question. It's a great question. It's like the capstone of your podcast. I think it's that imagination and science, or imagination and reason, have to be intertwined in a constructive way for us to avoid the excesses of both of them. So I'm reading a lot right now about the hinge or the transition between the Enlightenment and Romanticism. I'm fascinated by hinges in history, like the moments when things started to change. And Goya in particular is this artist, Francisco Goya, this artist who was kind of operating right at that hinge. And the beginning part of his career as an artist was very much around criticizing the evils and the mysteries and the superstitions and whatnot of pre-Enlightenment era and celebrating the kind of reason of the Enlightenment. And later in his career, started to observe, as many people did, the excesses of the Enlightenment and the sort of dehumanizing, the assault on dignity and people and rights or what were to become rights and so on of the Enlightenment, and the need to sort of like rectify the situation to bring a dignity, emotion, imagination back into the picture. And so there's this one piece of art that I love to look at, and it's Goya's, it's part of his Los Caprichos series called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. And so what's interesting, if you look at this, is this someone sort of slumbering or sleeping on a table. In the background, you see all of these like bats and creatures that kind of represent evil and mystery and threats and so on in the background. And you know, the Enlightenment interpretation of this is that when reason sleeps, the monsters of the dark period arise, right? And so you can think of this almost as like the accelerationists today are talking about AI as like AI is going to free us from the bonds, the trappings of the old way that we do things, and it's going to, you know, promises all these great things. And when we go to sleep, or if regulation tames us and we sleep, the bats and the evil come back. Okay, so but the interesting, Goya also had this caption that he attached to the image. Okay, and it reads something like, "It's imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters." Okay, united with her, she's the mother of the arts and the source of their wonders. Okay, and so this is really about how different ways of interpreting this, but my interpretation is that reason alone or imagination alone can bleed into either just pure dream or the excesses of the Enlightenment, and that when you entangle them together, you create the opportunity, the possibility of kind of like sustainable, responsible, valuable innovation and art, and society needs us to entangle these two together. And I think that we're at a precipice in history right now where the accelerationists kind of want us to I see it almost as like the excesses of the Enlightenment. They're pushing that direction, like science and AI, like these are the solutions to everything. We should just plow forward, and we're not concerned with dignity and emotion and imagination and what happens to us as humans, and all that sort of like collateral damage of the systems. And the pushback now is, well, no, you actually need to take into account all of those things if we're to actually create positive, value generating, like socially grounded and responsible innovation. So for me, like that hinge between Enlightenment and Romanticism is one I'm fascinated by. And again, like you're a historian, you'll appreciate this, like looking back at that and thinking about the application of some of the debates and lessons we learned in the course of the debate between these two things as the pendulum swung in different directions, and what excesses arose from each of them and what each was responding to. I think there's some great things that we can pull for today. So that, I guess that the only constant is that imagination and reason on their own can equally lead to excesses that we don't want, and entangled can create an amazing future for all of us. And we have the science of entanglement is the real challenge that we should be working on.
That is a perfect, brilliant answer, and you're connecting it to the complexities of everything we've spoken about on this episode, and you're really tickling my historian as well, and the whole I like these hinges as well. I always think it's always the upstream downstream from everything that's going on. That's the interesting thing, and what does it mean, and how do we connect these things? And the dialectics I also alluded to. I think it's an absolutely brilliant constant, Jason, and one that will be eternal as well, which I always love. So, and it's a new one. It's definitely a new one. So thank you so much for that constant, Jason, and thank you for having been a splendidly insightful and inquisitive, curious, and knowledgeable guest on The Only Constant. It's been a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Lasse. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to it. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, share it with a friend or a colleague.